Welcome to this week's episode, Should Canada Become English Only? A question of identity and fairness. My Polyglot Life is a podcast for language learners and teachers who like to think about how to learn and how to make education more efficient, inclusive, and connected to practical things like fitting into your daily life and in sync with our interests, especially if that includes feminism, social justice, and protecting the environment. If you're looking for content in French, I invite you to listen to the episodes of My Polyglot Life en français. But in this season, you'll also hear some episodes in English on the topic of bilingualism, Canada, and education or learning in the 21st century. I am Cathy Intro, that's a short for Introligator, yes, that's my name, a French-born language coach living in Canada. My practice integrates neuroscience research, coaching techniques, and language expertise. I am a certified neuro-language coach and also a teacher trainer for educators who want to enhance their skills and know what's behind the methods that you may use and you know it works, but you'd like to know why it works and how you can use them all the time to maintain students' engagement and support their progress. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, check out my YouTube channel and website, mypolyglotlife.com. You'd help me a lot if you could share with your friends and colleagues and also by leaving a review on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcasts. I would also like to acknowledge that the place where I live and work in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, lies on the unceded indigenous lands of the Kenyan Kihaka Mohawk Nation, a traditional gathering place for many First Nations. As we say in French, bonne écoute, enjoy the listening. Hello! For my first episode in English, I'd like to start strong and address the topic of bilingualism in Canada. Being obligated to learn French at school all across the country sucks, and translating everything into French and dealing with multiple norms because of the Quebec market costs a lot of money. We agree on that. There are many disadvantages to bilingualism in such a vast country as Canada. It's not easy, it's not comfortable, and many people will never get to speak the other official language, so they don't see the point of learning it. Why learn French? If you look at it through a purely capitalistic and economic perspective, maintaining French in Canada doesn't make sense. And even if you don't live in Canada but you speak English, you might think that it would be just more practical if everyone in the world spoke English, right? Let's officialize English as the communication language everywhere. Why not? Well, life isn't that simple. As humans, the concept of identity and how we define ourselves are important aspects of our existence, especially if our identity is threatened or rejected by others. And language, as a means of expression of our identity, personality, and values, is one of the main constituents of identity. You know what? I think everyone needs to learn at least one foreign language. I invite you to watch the video I published on YouTube about the 5 hidden and powerful reasons to learn languages. Indeed, I believe language learning, when done in a conscious way, promotes intercultural and self-awareness. And for that reason, the world benefits from maintaining the coexistence of different languages, and young people would benefit from seeing more multilingual adults in first world countries and also everywhere. I'll use Canada as a sort of case study because bilingualism is built into its constitution, but many points I'll raise could apply to immigrants and host countries everywhere in the world. Before diving in, I probably need to introduce 2 pieces of legislation specific to Quebec. In Canada, the federal institutions have to be bilingual. They need to be able to serve citizens in English and French. On the provincial level, it's different. There's only one bilingual province, New Brunswick, Nouveau-Brunswick in French, where citizens can, in theory, be served in English and in French. Nunavut and Northern Territories inhabitants may have special rights to be served in Inuktitut, the local language, the Inuit language, but I'm not sure what is the legislation there, so I'm not going to talk about it. But most provinces are Anglophone, meaning that, by law, services to citizens are provided only in English, although some agencies may provide translations in other languages, but by choice and not by law. Only Quebec is a francophone province. meaning that French is the language of the administration and education system. If you're interested in knowing more about this, check out the episode and interview on Quebec's quiet revolution, La Révolution Tranquille, that I did on a podcast and YouTube. That being said, there are laws protecting language minorities' rights. Francophones, so minorities are Francophones in English-speaking provinces and Anglophones in Quebec. So there are laws protecting language minority rights in regards to access to public education and health services in their language. And in Quebec, because there is a need to protect the use of the French language for historical reasons and also because we are surrounded by millions of English speakers in Canada and the USA, there are specific language laws. The main one was voted in 1977. It's called Bill 101, Loi 101, also called Charte de la langue française. And it made Quebec a francophone province by law, which means that education has to be primarily in French, except for the Anglophone Québécois minority who's been there for generations. And French has to be the language of communication both between the administration and citizens, but also the language of business and signage on the streets. The Office québécois de la langue française is in charge of coming up with French translations for new vocabulary. For example, un balado is what we call a podcast in Quebec. But everyone understands a podcast, so that's why we need to make an effort to use those French words. So, Bill 101 imposed strict conditions to ensure that French would remain the main language of the province, but because Montreal is such an international city and attracts many immigrants, it is becoming more and more bilingual, and in some parts of the city, like downtown, English is becoming the default language. Young people from Montreal often feel more comfortable in English because it feels easier than French, and they consume a lot of North American and international pop culture in English. For that reason, the current assembly, led by Mr. Legault and Coalition Avenir Québec, voted last year, a controversial law called Bill 96, Loi 96, to reinforce the Charte de la langue française and go further than Bill 101. It states that all government officials should communicate with new immigrants, with no exceptions for refugees and asylum seekers, exclusively in French, except for a grace period for the first 6 months after the immigrant's arrival. 6 months, that's a bit unrealistic, isn't it? If you have no or basic knowledge of French before your arrival, it would be really hard to handle health-related or complex conversation and paperwork all in French in such a short amount of time, as you are settling down and sorting out how to start a new life in a new country on top of that. In my opinion, it was done to appeal to sovereignist voters, to people who are scared of immigration and who prefer to stay with their own community over collaboration. On the ground, the implementation of this new law feels very restrictive, puts a lot of pressure on people, especially immigrants and businesses. And in the end, it might just be counterproductive because it just makes people hate French more. There is a need for legislation and for incentives to learn French. But was it the right way to do it? I'm not sure. I don't think so. Okay, now that you know the situation and the jargon, Bill 101, Bill 96, let's come back to bilingualism in Canada and in general. There is a problem with bilingualism in Canada. Well, okay, probably more than one. But one of them is that it is unfair. Now, if you're a monolingual Anglophone, you might think it's unfair that you have or had to learn French at school, or that your kids might be unable to apply to the best universities because that new Bill 96 forces them to take 3 major classes in French or French language classes in Cégep, which are the first 2 years after high school, and it might impact their grade and their application to universities. I know, it sucks. Especially because the way French is usually taught in school makes it tedious, boring, and makes you feel like an idiot. I hear you, and I'm sorry you have or had to experience this. On the other hand, You may also have had a great teacher who made it fun and made you want to keep learning, and now you understand my podcast in French. So kudos to both of you, the great teacher and you for being a great student. However, this is not what I'm referring to when I say it's unfair. Bilingualism is unfair. And what I'm about to say might help you see the situation in a new light. Maybe you've never thought about this before. First, we need to acknowledge the fact that neither English nor French are the native languages of the original inhabitants of Turtle Island, part of which we now call Canada. Second, we need to acknowledge the fact that the Confederation of Canada has been built and consolidated over the years by an alliance of English-speaking and French-speaking settlers and their descendants. For many reasons, the Francophone minority never assimilated fully in Quebec. They maintain their culture and language, although it's becoming more and more challenging in smaller communities outside of Quebec, like in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and in the north, isolated from the larger Francophone populations of Quebec and New Brunswick. I heard on a podcast that Francophone communities make up only 2% of the population of Canada outside of Quebec. However, many more Canadians have ancestors who spoke French, but the family language got lost, and now they're trying to learn or relearn their heritage language, or they regret they can't speak it at all. So that's how it is. French and English coexist here. Of course, it poses tremendous difficulties to implement a true bilingualism on such a vast territory, and the situation is less than ideal. But the Confederation of Canada is officially bilingual, and its institutions are obligated to provide services to the population in both official languages. As I read in an opinion piece by Brian Miles in Le Devoir, there's the link in the show notes, it's an article in French. In Canada, bilingualism includes English. So if your first language or the traditional language of your nation is not English, it means that as a kid, you must learn your mother tongue, your parents' tongue, like all kids, and it could be French, or if your parents are immigrants from Mexico, you would learn Spanish, or if they're from an indigenous community and they know the traditional language and they may want to pass it down to you, maybe you would learn Atikamekw, for example. There are still many people in Quebec and France who don't speak English, especially older generations, but they usually know at least a few words. And nowadays, as kids get older, as they start school and then become teenagers and listen to international music, watch films, play video games, they start being exposed to and learning English naturally. So in modern Canada, if English is not your mother tongue, you learn one language already. And then you start the process of developing a bilingual brain very early on because of all that input in English coming in. And most likely, if your parents immigrated from somewhere else and they speak English, you'll develop a trilingual brain because if they immigrated to Quebec, then you will be going to school in French. So that's a lot of languages for a small kid. Having a bilingual or multilingual brain has advantages, but maintaining 2 or more of your languages at a high level in all 4 skills, listening, reading, speaking, writing, requires time and effort, and probably money spent on language classes or tutors. Time, effort, and money that Canadian English speakers who are not learning another language can spend on something else. For most people on the planet, we're already beyond bilingualism. Many people may speak dialects, but they at least understand some of another language, because they live in a country where the official language is different from their dialect. And English is so prevalent everywhere that people are exposed to it and pick up words or make an effort to learn it to have access to certain opportunities. Many people can speak a language, but they can't read or write in it though. However, the question for many people is not how to become bilingual. Rather, it is how to become tri or more lingual. What other language on top of English do you need or want to learn? And how do you build on the skills you've acquired already to learn this new language? And this is my job as a neuro-language coach, to help you learn even more languages and build on your existing skills. But this is not the topic of today's episode. If you want to know more, just send me an email, contact me, and we can have a chat about your needs. But now let's talk about the question of the motivation to learn French in Canada. The question I asked myself initially when I thought of this episode was, how do we motivate kids at school to learn another language, and namely French here in Canada? And also, secondary question, how can we help immigrants in Quebec become proficient in French? If you're a parent, a teacher, or someone who wants newcomers to feel welcome in the community, I think you're probably wondering the same thing. But then I realized I was following the crowd, but I had forgotten to check the blind spot the article I mentioned earlier had pointed out. Bilingualism in Canada includes English. In the case of immigrants who have already made efforts to become proficient in English and experienced the stress of the immigration process and relocation to a new country, starting a new job, which may or may not be in line with their qualifications and previous work experience, how do we motivate these people to learn French, learn it fast and well? Is it even fair to ask so much from them while providing so little support? The Quebec government pays for some francisation classes. Francisation. So that's French as second language, French as foreign language classes for immigrants. But it's not for everyone. And what do you do if you have a family to support and have to work full-time? How do you dedicate your full attention to the language? What if you don't learn well in a classroom setting? What if they don't address self-confidence issues in francisation classes, but mostly grammar and vocabulary, as is often the case? And don't get me wrong, you do need some knowledge of the grammar if you want to be able to work in French in an office job or get a good grasp of formal or professional French. But it may not help you to communicate with locals on the streets speaking informal Quebec French. So I decided to change my question to, how do we motivate Anglophone kids and adults in monolingual families to learn another language, to help them take that step to bridge the gap with immigrants and have a shared experience of learning a language and being vulnerable? And another secondary question, how do we motivate Francophone kids to develop an advanced French? Because it makes me sad that some kids turn to English because they feel bad with French. The way many people see it, French is like a punishment. Even Francophone kids may see their French class as a punishment because of all the grammar rules and exceptions and the emphasis placed on spelling. Of course, I believe having a certain knowledge of spelling is important, but teaching the rules to kids who don't know why they need to know that is useless. It's meaningless. And when something feels meaningless, we usually don't put a lot of energy into it. I also believe some kind of legislation is necessary because people tend to see the short-term reward and choose the easy way, and then they might regret it later, when it's too late to do something. When you turn 50 and health issues start to pile up, you can quit smoking, drinking, and start exercising, but you won't make up for all the damage done. Taxes on liquor and cigarettes help lower the consumption. Well, laws 101 and 96 are like taxes, in my opinion. They might be annoying for the users, the speakers, but they help maintain the culture alive. So yes, maintaining the presence of French in North America is an uphill battle. It's not the easy way. And if you're currently learning French, thank you for your effort, and if you haven't started but are considering it, now's a good time. Don't waste more time. Pick up French, pick up another language, just try the experience. And there are many people willing to help and support you. As for me, I'm always torn between English and French in my communications. I feel like English allows me to share what I have to say with a wider audience, and to explain my services and approach to all levels of learners and to international teachers and coaches, so that learners who can't yet read or listen to French fluently can understand. On the other hand, I like publishing content in French, slightly adapted for learners, to give you an opportunity to practice, because that's how you'll train your French muscles and get familiar with the culture. But also because, as I was reminded a few times by listeners of my podcast, Not everyone understands English well, and their strongest foreign language might be French. So, publishing content in French for French learners makes it also accessible to a non-Anglophone audience. But it is often double the work, like having two websites, or a source of frustration when I'm not able to share in both languages a piece of valuable content. But it's worth the extra effort when I find the time. But my decision to participate in the promotion and diffusion of French and also to use my second language, English, to communicate has a price. I am paying the cost in time, energy, and money. I'm not sure that English speakers who are afraid of speaking another language because they feel unable to do it or uncomfortable realize that other people, namely non-English speakers, have to get over their own fear to accommodate English speakers who shy away from stepping out of their comfort zone. I don't mean that to make you feel guilty. Language-related fears may be deeply rooted in your subconscious for many reasons, and that's why I'm here as a language coach to help you overcome your obstacles. But sometimes it's good to get out of your own head and hear a different version of the story. You have saved time, energy, and money by not learning how to communicate in another language. But many other people have to pay to take their English to a higher level. Of course, speaking English better is often quickly rewarded. It becomes easier to communicate while traveling, at least in certain parts of the world. It may open up better job opportunities. You can access international content written in English about all kinds of topics of interest. The reward of speaking French or another language may not be so immediate, making it hard to stay motivated when you hit a plateau, which happens to everyone. So, how do you start and keep the momentum on a path to bilingualism, especially when you already speak English? As often with human behavior, the key is finding the need that will fuel the motivation. Let's come back to my initial question, because there's something wrong with it. How do we motivate people or kids? Well, unfortunately, you can't motivate someone. Have you ever tried to motivate a teenager to do something? You can try to convince them, seduce them, talk them into doing something, trick them into doing something also. But to be powerful enough to sustain your stamina through the tough process of learning a language, it has to come from within. What will you gain from knowing this language? How will you feel when you get to that level you want to achieve? When talking about motivation, there's this image of the stick and the carrot. The stick may work in the short term, and that's often what the school system and exams use, but it's not associated with positive emotions. It's not something most people feel good about. Actually, this is often one of my first priorities as a language coach. How can I make you like learning or interacting in French? If you enjoy the process, I know you'll show up and you'll do the work and progress. I won't have to motivate you. I'll just need to be there for you, to offer support, to challenge you and listen to your pains and find ways to bring back some joy. Having a carrot, a reward, is a more positive approach, but you have to choose your carrot wisely. Pick something that means a lot to you, and it doesn't need to be rational. Ask your kid or students to be creative when thinking about ways they would benefit from knowing French or improving it. Don't barge in and interfere with your adult brain. Let them pursue their train of thought. The first step is to get them interested, hooked on French, that they find a purpose to it. Then the learning will happen. When there's a need, there's a way. And even more if you offer your support. You may need to close your eyes on a few spelling mistakes at first before you can find how to introduce error correction without making them feel discouraged. Honestly, I'm not sure we can afford to be picky with the so-called quality of French if we want to maintain its existence in North America. We have to be picky about communication skills. I mean, the ideas need to be clearly expressed, and in the professional and academic world, precise vocabulary is often necessary. But this is specialty training. It's part of the professional training. Don't forget we're talking about bilingual or trilingual young people here. Their brain processes multiple languages at the same time, and it just picks the most efficient route. Interferences happen. That's how the brain works. If you're a teacher, tutor, or coach listening to this and you're wondering how you could learn about the brain, identify a compelling motivation with your learners and follow the path of a positive education with a horizontal and collaborative structure rather than vertical and hierarchical, I'd like to share some exciting news. I am now a teacher trainer with efficient language coaching, and I deliver training in English or in French to become a certified neuro-language coach. If you'd like to know more, click on the link in the show notes to read about the training and to be added to the waitlist for the next training session with me, in French or in English. As I mentioned before, there's another way to look at the fair-unfair question about bilingualism. Coming back to Bill 96, parents complain that their kids will be negatively impacted because they now have to follow 3 major classes in French, or to take French classes, French language classes. And because of that, their grades might be lower than expected and prevent them from entering the best universities. I was a bit shocked when I heard that because, well, that's exactly what non-native English students must do, without any other alternative. If they want to apply to a top university in Canada or the US, they must make sure their English is good enough. I guess I understand that the change is quite brutal, and the kids who will enter Cégep in the next couple of years haven't had time to prepare and step up their game in French. But I assume there will be a transition period or that it can be negotiated for a few years. For example, in McGill University, which is Anglophone or bilingual, students have the option to submit their assignments in French. In theory, but I read it can be a bit more complicated in reality. But I guess a similar system could be implemented at Cégep level until the school system adapts and trains students in English and French equally. And here we face a problem with French: the amount of time it takes to study the rules and exceptions of spelling, which takes time away from other topics or skills. What I'm going to say is controversial, but I'm not the only one who thinks this way. I'm not sure we can afford to be super strict on each and every rule of the French language in a minority context such as North America. We might have to pick the most important ones and simplify a bunch of things to make the language less irregular. I'm not going to make friends at Académie Française or Gazette de Montréal, but I don't really care about them. However, as Goethe wrote, or something like that in German, you don't know your language until you know at least another one. So if we were to conceive truly bilingual curricula, we might be surprised at the outcome. I'm sure there have been experiments in some places and schools, so if you know any, let me know and I'd love to read about it. The bilingual brain can be very creative with concepts and language, so I'm sure it could lead to interesting things. Okay, maybe I'm not the best person to advise people on how languages should be taught to children. For me, languages are fun and I see patterns quickly. My brain was wired for this, I think. But I've learned to listen to the experience of others and I hear the struggle. And as a result, I'm convinced that there shouldn't be one way of teaching and evaluating languages. If the purpose is that people communicate in a foreign language, we should focus on communication and not break students' motivation with written and oral tests that are inefficient. Fill in the blanks and multiple choice questions may be the worst kind of test. If you get a good score, it gives you a false sense that you understand something. But the elements have been fed to you. It's much harder when you have to come up with everything from scratch. This, making sentences from scratch, practicing with topics relevant to the learner's interests, is messy, it's hard, there are a lot of mistakes. But when it's done in a positive and patient environment, it's also very rewarding and produces results. What do you think? Have you had to experience any of that? Taking tests, or being really good at multiple choice questions, or fill the blanks, but then unable to speak and create your own sentences? Or on the contrary, have you just picked up the language spontaneously without studying? Let me know in the comments, send me an email, I'd love to hear about your experience. So for that reason, I just mentioned about the tests not being the best way to evaluate someone's language skills. I'd like to see less tests, but more culture and pop culture oriented language training for newcomers and Canadian kids and teenagers. I have a problem with immigration language tests. On the one hand, they're necessary because otherwise many people wouldn't bother learning the language. On the other hand, it's possible to kind of fake them to a certain extent. You work on ticking the right boxes at the exam, but it doesn't mean you'll have the confidence to apply what you learn in real life. Many candidates may sound like robots. They repeat things they don't really understand, but they struggle with expressing themselves in their own voice, to transform their brain into a French bilingual brain and find their own voice unapologetically with all the mistakes, but making their point. The Immigration Bureau here in Quebec and Canada requires at least a B2 level in French to qualify for the Quebec residency or bilingual status to score extra points at the federal level. But even a B2 level doesn't mean you can work in French, especially if you've studied Parisian or international French and you immigrate to Quebec. The preparation is about the language, but not the culture, and it doesn't help you build self-confidence in real-life interactions. I'd rather ask for a lower level, like a B1, but add more language and cultural training in the month following the arrival of the new immigrant and their family, to bring them slowly to a true B2 level. And I think some kind of mentoring would be nice too. Pairing new immigrants with volunteer individuals or families who would help them feel integrated in the community and practice the language. And because employers would benefit from having multilingual individuals who are trained to navigate cross-cultural relationships, why not imagine splitting the cost of such programs between public and corporate funding? I know that the obligations imposed by Bill 101 and 96 are a financial burden for companies in Quebec and make the province less attractive. But that's because Canada isn't truly bilingual. In Quebec, all communications, including letters from the administration and signage, have to be in French. That's the law. But to provide services to the Anglophone minority and due to the importance of the relationships with the rest of Canada and the USA, in reality, pretty much everything else is already bilingual. That's because in today's world, English is essential, French is not. But if the requirement to be proficient in another language, or true bilingualism on a provincial level everywhere, with services available in French, if it was extended to everyone in the country, Anglophones would also experience the challenges of the process of bilingualism. For the adults and newcomers, we can only do our best given the circumstances we inherited from the past. But for the kids at school across Canada, there must be a better way to approach languages. I know that many teachers do the best they can, but it's hard to provoke interest in something other than English. The power of attraction is strong. We need to be creative. We can't go on like we've been doing until now. The system must adapt to the youth of today. And we know that learning languages through social interactions and play comes easily to kids. When they grow up and need to develop more advanced language skills, maybe we need to accept that not everyone needs to develop their skills to the same extent at the same time. If the foundations are solid and they've built a habit of speaking and reading in French, they'll be able to pick up from there when the need arises, if it ever does. We need to agree on where the foundations are, of course, and how to make sure the children acquire them, beyond tests and in real life. Language has multiple facets. One of them is a tool for communication, a lingua franca, a vehicular language that helps get a point across, transmit a message from one person to another, whether orally or in writing. This one doesn't need to be complex. On the contrary, the more straightforward it is, the better it can be understood. Another facet of the language is art. It can be literature, songs, poetry, eloquence. There's no limit to creativity with this kind. And there will always be people who will want to push the limits and be creative with the language. Another use is as a tool to exert domination and exclude some people from a social circle. Depending on the speaker, the context, the situation, we use different facets of the language. So instead of this limiting vision that there are good and bad versions of the language, we should instead train individuals to recognize the multiple identities of a language and to switch between them. We need to be able to adapt our language to the context, to improve communication, to promote creativity, or to include rather than to exclude. Mastering words and using critical thinking gives real power, and it shouldn't be reserved to a small category of the population. In conclusion, I'd say that I've met 3 types of language learners. The ones who don't want to learn but have not been given a choice. For example, their employers require them to learn the language or to improve, or children at school. Second type are the others who learn because they feel they have to for work or personal reasons, but they decided by themselves to take lessons. They were not forced. And finally, the third type are those who learn for pure pleasure or personal challenge. And no matter your situation, it's crucial to identify your need and find a compelling motivation or vision. In my opinion, that is what's missing from the way languages are taught in school. They're too abstract. And also, we need more social relationships, interactions, and opportunities to practice in a fun atmosphere like games. Even if you can't travel and do an immersion, take your class or learner on a virtual trip, or take them to a park and make this a language field trip. I know there are many teachers who have great ideas out there, and I'm a bit out of touch with classroom teaching, but I'm always very inspired when I hear about those stories. And today I touched very briefly on the topic of grammar, but I'll come back to it in the next episode, which will be in French. One quality people often cite about English is that the grammar is relatively simple, at least up to an intermediate level like B2. There are no gendered nouns, a table, a couch, whereas in French it's une table, un canapé. Verb endings do not vary with each pronoun. That's just to name a couple of things that are easier in English than in French, Spanish, or German, for example. So the question I'll answer in 2 weeks is: Français, allemand et autres, ces langues doivent-elles simplifier leur grammaire pour attirer plus d'apprenants et apprenantes? Should French, German, and others simplify their grammar to attract more learners? Don't forget to subscribe and share this podcast and leave a comment on my social media to engage the conversation. À bientôt!